Good evening, one and all. I can't tell you how pleased to have you all here tonight. R's and D's, and people who appreciate fine and good government all. I'm Roberta Stanley. I'm the president of the Michigan Political History Society. I had the pleasure not only to work on Capitol Hill, but to lobby Capitol Hill on behalf of the state of Michigan for almost 30 years. And in doing so, I worked very closely with the Michigan delegation, which when I did that was one of the most powerful delegations in the United States. And may I say, it was also a delegation that we were particularly proud of. And one of those we would be most proud of is the gentleman at the table with the orange socks on. Oh my. Anyway, may I say, Congressman Fred Upton, his background is on the literature you've been handed, but as a person who lobbied on Capitol Hill, he was available, always available and sincere. And I picked up this word from the Almanac of American Politics, and you know, the original author of that is a Michigander, Michael Barone. Affable. What a nice word. And also, having worked on Capitol Hill, a lot of members are not affable, she said, but also incredibly smart and schooled in government. Just a couple quick vignettes I have. I went into his office right after he'd become a chairman. And on Capitol Hill, in that culture, becoming a chairman, I never used chairwoman, Madam Chair. Becoming a chairman's a big deal, so I walk in his office, I said, "Congratulations, Mr. Chairman." And he goes, "Roberta, I know you hang around with all those important people. It's just Fred." Well, interestingly enough, that's in the Almanac of American Politics, too. Another time, I'm sitting in my office in the Michigan Department of Ed, kind of behaving myself. I get this phone call. "Roberta Stanley?" "Yes." "This is Terry Donahue from the U.S. Department of Justice." Well, I sat right up in my chair. "You have been recommended by Congressman Fred Upton as someone to work with to assist the Benton Harbor Public Schools. And I'd like to work with you, and we're going to work with the U.S. Attorney from the Western District, and we're going to help them spend their federal government money more wisely because they get a lot of it. Would that be possible?" I said, "Well, I got to talk to the superintendent." And, you know, we went through superintendents a lot, and he said, "You know, I really don't want you to do this, but I guess I have no choice, do I?" "No." So I'm driving down I-94, and the air conditioning in my car wasn't working. But, you know, I went back and forth a lot, and we got a lot done to help Benton Harbor be a better place. Fred was a cut above. He continues to be a cut above. And may I say how happy I am that he's affiliated with Michigan. He and the other gentleman standing over here were the two best members of Congress who represented my hometown of Coldwater. And unlike one of them, they never threw me out of their office. Anyway, I now give you the Honorable Fred Upton. Congressman, excuse me, Joe Schwartz to introduce Congressman Upton. I knew I was going to screw up. Anyway, here you go.
You may be able to hear me without the microphone, can you?
Yeah, they want it for the TV.
The what?
The camera.
Damn thing is heavy.
You want me to hold it?
No, I'm fine, Fred. Fred Upton is one of my favorite people of any people that I know. When I got elected to Congress, for my lengthy career in Congress, but when I got elected to Congress in 2004 and went to the swearing-in day, which was Congress was sworn in and W was sworn in for his second term, et cetera, et cetera. Fred was my mentor that day. And he took it upon himself to make sure I didn't screw up, to make sure that I ended up in the same place, that I wasn't in Baltimore or Philadelphia or someplace like that. And we walked around the Capitol. Look, the crowd is coming in. And Fred knew the damnedest places to go and get around the crowd I've ever seen. And you know, I asked him if he worked for a plumbing company, because that's where we were going to get back.
That was Nixon.
That's right, the plumbers. That's right. It was Nixon. But nobody knew the Capitol better, and the little nooks and crannies and how you got from point A to point B to point C and back to point A than Fred. And so I followed Fred around that day and was just shaking my head and saying, well, Fred, where in the hell are we going now? He said, just follow me. Just follow me. So I did, and we did very, very, very well. I got into tunnels in the Capitol that I never was in after that. Some hallways I was never in after that. It was great stuff. So nobody knew the Capitol building like Fred, and I could not have had a better geographic mentor for that day than Fred. And after swearing in and we got going for the congressional session, Fred was always my go-to guy to get advice, to find out what was real and what wasn't, to find out who to avoid and who not to avoid. And as you who have dealt with the legislature and dealt with Congress, you know damn well there are people that you avoid and people that you don't avoid. And if you don't take that as a given, bad things will happen to you. So Fred was a guy that I would go to for advice. His advice was always impeccable, as was his career of 36 years. That is 36 years in the United States House of Representatives. I think the only one at the time, you were at about 34, 36 years, that had more time on station than yourself was John Dingell. Yeah. But
John
Conyers too.
We can keep coming up with them.
Yeah, you have to go to the old folks' home, but you'll find them. In any event, Fred and I not only were colleagues in the Congress, we are friends, and I was a great admirer of his work in Congress and his tremendous ability to work across the aisle and get things done. He wanted a product. He wanted something to be accomplished, and he did, over those 36 years, accomplish a huge, huge amount. Fred is from Southwest Michigan, as you know. He's a Berrien County guy. He was born in St. Joseph. I won't tell you the year. Well, I will tell you the year, 1953. He's a University of Michigan grad. I got to be very careful about that tonight, Fred.
You're safe.
They asked for my passport coming in.
That's right. That's right. Fred, when he was an undergraduate, which was a few years after I was an undergraduate, like 15, belonged to the fraternity, which was right next to my fraternity, on State Street. He was Alpha Delta Phi, and I was a Sigma Chi. Pardon? But we had a lot in common with the university, with our political feelings about issues. We are both very moderate Republicans, which is a dying breed. I hope it doesn't die off, but folks, there ain't many left. So we'll see how it all goes. Hopefully it continues. Fred's congressional career was distinguished with the highest distinction. He was chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee for 6 years. He was looked up to by both Republicans and Democrats in the House as someone that they could speak to and receive good advice from. I cannot think of anybody that had a more distinguished career, a more bipartisan career, a more helpful career, a more patriotic career in the U.S. House than the 36 years Fred Upton was there. So tonight, it is my pleasure, absolute pleasure and honor to introduce to you someone who needs no introduction, Fred Upton, former Congressman for 36 years from this state and one of the greatest guys you'll ever meet. Fred.
Thank you all for coming. It is a delight to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to reflect on my 36 years in the House, working with 7 presidents and 7 speakers. Yes, we had quite the run. 25 contestations. But I never could have done it without the strong and loyal, passionate staff and with an understanding wife, Amy, most of the time. I was blessed from the get-go and had 2 of my staff actually stay with me all 36 years. And I grabbed one of Joe Schwartz's top aides when he left 17 years ago, who stayed with me to the very end. And he's now the chief of staff to another Midwestern Republican in the Congress. So many wonderful Michigan colleagues where I had meaningful relationships working together on both sides of the aisle. And not doing a long list, but I look at Debbie Dingell, who I talk to literally a couple times a week. She had a bad cold this weekend. Mike Rogers, Dave Camp, John Dingell, Joe Nolenberg, Carl Purcell, Dan Kildee, Candace Miller, Jack Bergman, Bart Stupak, Carl Levin, Alyssa Slotkin, Peter Meyer, all Joe Schwartz. So special in our relationships in terms of what we did. So, I graduated with a journalism degree from Michigan, hoping to be a sports writer. Yeah, the Lions were finally going to make it, maybe. But nobody called. So I volunteered, and I managed a couple of counties for Dave Stockman with Jeff McKelvey. Jeff's here tonight. Where is Jeff? Right here, from Benton Harbor. Back in '86, we became really good friends. Can't tell all the stories we know, but we scared out the incumbent, Ed Hutchinson. And I went on to D.C. for the first time ever, and I was in charge of constituent service from that end of Dave's congressional office. Our theme was that if we could fix it in 3 Oaks, we sure could fix it in 3 Rivers. Fast forward to the White House, where I ultimately headed congressional affairs for OMB, and I worked with the Congress on every issue but national security on behalf of the administration. Local community leaders reached out to me in August of '85 asking if I would come back to challenge the incumbent, Mark Siljander. I said, no, thank you. I'm happily married. I still am. I've got 2 black labs. I sit behind the president in the cabinet room every other week. Why would I want to change that? Well, a couple months later, they convinced Amy and I to come back and test the waters. And the 4th District Republican Chair, Harold Shoemaker, who is one that had run in '82, I called him and I said that I would certainly defer to him. If he wanted to run again, he had my full support, but he said no, and he endorsed me. So our big campaign issue in '86 with Siljander was that he refused to debate, and he missed more than 350 votes in his 5 years. And despite being outspent 3-1, we defeated the only incumbent in the country in a primary that cycle. And we went from a dead heat in June to a double-digit win in August when he made a critical mistake asking voters to fast to break the back of Satan. You know, I can remember on the radio, they asked him about that, and they said, are you calling Upton Satan? And there was no response. And it went about 15 or 20 seconds of silence, and the radio guy said, Bob DeWitt from WSJM, he goes, Mark, are you still there? Oh yeah, I'm here. Like, well, Mark later pled guilty to a number of federal charges, leading to a year in federal prison, and ultimately a pardon just last year by the guy who said he would drain the swamp. At that point in my lifetime, the Republicans had never controlled the House. And our 100th freshman class was as diverse and as talented as could be. We had 2 future speakers in Pelosi and Hastert. We had an MLB Hall of Famer in Jim Bunning, civil rights icon John Lewis, the first ever elected Fortune 100 CEO of Amo Houghton, and future committee chairs, poobahs among us. But I decided to follow the course of not attacking windmills, but getting things done. And that would only happen with bipartisanship and working with both sides of the aisle. So during my lifetime, my tenure, no member of Congress cast more votes than me, some 20,000 plus. Often it was due to the personal stories that I witnessed here in Michigan that drove my passion and sometimes a high-profile vote against the party line. I knew, as an example, how the Michigan background checks worked because I went to see my Berrien County Sheriff, and I asked to see what my criminal record was. Well, guess what? It took about 2 minutes. No reason, clean. No reason to think why other states couldn't impose the same system on their residents to prevent felons from legally purchasing a gun, and I was then afforded police protection with my co-sponsorship of the Brady Bill. I later met with the Columbine, Sandy Hook, and then Parkland school shooting survivors. Fast forward to the shootings here on campus at MSU. An active shooter alert on our cell phones, mine's overcharging over here, might have saved some lives in other places if they'd had an active alert on that cell phone. And I was the lead Republican to allow communities to participate if they choose. The NRA was neutral, but the gun owners scored it as a no, and it failed in the House. So we tried it again, and it passed a month later, but it got stopped in the Senate last December, not becoming law. No way today, Chairman Jim Jordan of the Judiciary Committee will let it get out of his committee despite the alleged promise from former Speaker McCarthy that they would consider it again in this Congress. My visits to combat zones in Iraq and Afghanistan, I saw the burn pits firsthand. I remembered Agent Orange in Vietnam that poisoned our troops. So I defied my leadership again, who were saying it was going to be simply too expensive to provide the VA disability benefits to those troops who were poisoned by those gases. As vice chair of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus in a closely divided House, I helped craft and pass a major infrastructure bill providing money for roads and bridges, airports, broadband, and replacing lead service lines. We dismissed the massive entitlement changes leading to that would have led to hundreds of billions of dollars in new spending that the Biden administration wanted, and we did what Ronald Reagan would want. We paid for it. That bill passed the Senate with 69 votes. Yet my leadership fought us every step as it would be a major win for the Biden administration, and wouldn't it be better if we just waited until 2025 when we'd have a Republican president again that could do this and get credit for it? I would note that there was no infrastructure initiative offered by the Trump administration in the 4 years when he was president. The same argument was used again on the computer chips legislation. A win for the Biden team when we should wait till 25 and allow U.S. manufacturing of chips to decline even further from the 40% of the world's market share that we'd had just a couple of decades ago. So what will now exceed $100 billion in new manufacturing private sector jobs would have gone someplace else overseas. And even those Republicans in the states where the jobs were going, their arms were broken and they voted no, even some that spoke in favor of legislation on the House floor the day before. Mary Barra gave me a big bear hug at the Detroit Auto Show last year because of its enactment and the impact on autos, appliances, and telecommunications. And finally, an early 7 a.m. phone call during the August recess from John Dingell, who didn't always need a phone. He'd just open a window. And he said, "Fred, the auto industry is in big trouble. Have you heard from GM yet? They need financing to survive, and there are no financial suitors anywhere. We got to get this done by Labor Day." Well, the two of us helped craft the rescue plan. We worked with Speaker Boehner and key members of our delegation, Dave Camp, Gary Peters, Carl Levin, Debbie Stabenow, to marshal it through. We succeeded in getting Obama and McCain to publicly support the cause. Despite the flack that we took, the money was paid back, and auto survived what would have crippled Michigan and all of its automobile suppliers forever. My first law enacted was to provide tax credits for small businesses that made structural changes to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. My Democratic lead was a guy later headed the NAACP, Kwesi Mfume. I think I was the only guy that could spell it or say it. Kwesi Mfume. Sort of like my initials, Mfume. I now remember him grabbing my lapels in the well of the house after we passed this. And he grabbed me and he said, "Fred, you have cost me. I was a 0 with the Chamber of Commerce, and now I'm a 20. I'm going to have a primary because of this bill that was hailed as the most significant piece of legislation helping small businesses enacted in that Congress." In '91, I was able to convince my Republican colleagues to get on the Energy and Commerce Committee, to which John Dingell said our jurisdiction was like 2 words. 2 words. First word. Come on, you guys know this, right? Little, that's right. Second word, world, the world. That was our jurisdiction.
Right.
We were right. 75% of the major bills that get to the president's desk originate from our committee. And looking back, I did change the world when my amendment extending daylight savings time was adopted, and the rest of the world changed with us. Then we did light bulbs. That came too, same bill. Speaker Gingrich asked me to be the Republican lead to double the funding for health research for the NIH, and John McCain was my partner in the Senate. We used my friend and constituent Muhammad Ali to help our effort, and I called him when the president signed it into law, President Clinton. September 11th came, and I can remember every moment like it was yesterday. My house in Virginia is only a mile or 2 from the Pentagon, and I drove through the parking lot as my shortcut to the 14th Street Bridge that morning about an hour before the plane hit. My top, yes, I turned 40, my top in my Chrysler Sebring convertible was down, and I had my shades on. And later that day, I drove through the smoke to get home and was on site the next day as well. And then up to New York with the first responders still looking for possible survivors. I was then the chairman of the Telecommunications Subcommittee, and I led the effort to tackle the #1 resolution of the 9/11 Commission, to force the broadcasters, and this was hard, to abandon their analog signals and convert to digital, allowing for the spectrum to be sold, taxpayers benefited, but it allowed the spectrum to be sold to the communication giants like AT&T and Verizon, so that they could build the devices that we all use today that can send texts and videos, and we could reserve some of that new spectrum for our first responders so that they in fact could communicate with their partners as they went into burning buildings. New TVs for everyone, or else no signal. When Newt became Speaker, he changed the rules as to how chairman would be named for each committee. Beforehand, if you were on a committee and you just kept getting elected, ultimately someday you would sit in the chairman's spot. So if those old rules were still in place today, I still wouldn't be chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Joe Barton would still be there. As chair, I changed the rules of our committee, allowing for bipartisanship amendments to go first in the queue, knowing that if we could pass them on a bipartisan vote, chances were that we could get that bill passed on the House floor. With that same margin, we could get the attention in the Senate, and we could get the bills to the President. In my 6 years as chair, we saw more than 200 bills reach President Obama's desk for his signature. Obviously all bipartisan, and compare that to the only 14 bills that have been enacted in this Congress so far this year under President Biden. Dan Kildee, a good friend, a guy we're going to miss in our delegation, walked me through the federal side of the Flint water crisis. And we passed his first bill, barely without a hearing, requiring the EPA to inform the state and locals about lead contamination within 24 hours and to begin working on a plan to correct it. Obama, to his credit, fired the Chicago Regional EPA director when he learned that she had sat on that information for months. But our legacy issue is certainly 21st century cures. A bill that took 3 years to get through, that took endless roundtables, hearings, and discussions, a real process of Congress listening to all of the stakeholders, from disease groups to industry to government officials. Last week, I received the distinguished Reagan-Udall FDA Innovation Award for seeing this bill to the finish, which was the last bill that President Obama signed into law on December 13th, 2016, 7 years ago to the day. We need it every day, including Thanksgiving Day, to pass it 392 to 26 in the House. Yes, I know all the 26 that voted no, including a wannabe speaker that didn't quite make it in October. And we survived a Senate filibuster that even Chuck Schumer supported, but ultimately passed 92 to 8. Friday, the FDA approved a sickle cell cure that was a direct result of cures. Wouldn't have happened without it. The Pfizer and Moderna COVID vaccines were allowed to be manufactured and packaged before the FDA approval, allowing them to be dispensed many months before they otherwise would have made it, thanks to our legislation, saving who knows how many hundreds of thousands of people. The cancer moonshot was included as part of that bill. Now, most weeks I traveled home, as my staff know, back and forth. I've driven that route. I know where the cops are. I've traveled it. I'll drive it again next week, over 300 times. But I did some overseas travel too. I think one of my first trips was to Baghdad. It was a bipartisan trip that I led, and I picked some of my Republican and Democratic buddies to go with me. We had to stay in Kuwait overnight, as it was not safe to stay in the green zone. We traveled on a Black Hawk helicopter with General Petraeus, and we went from Mosul to the south. We took flak in our C-130, and we had to stay when we were landing in Baghdad. And as a consequence, the plane wouldn't go, couldn't take us back, and so we actually stayed at Uday's Palace one night in the green zone. Yes, we found some Coors Light. We had a good colonel with us in charge. The front page of the Kuwaiti Sunday Times that morning showed an American Humvee in flames on the road on the airport, from the airport to the green zone, hit by an IED that we were on that same road that afternoon. And we brought back 3 flag-draped caskets secured on the floor of the C-130. In Afghanistan, when I met with President Karzai, we outmaneuvered a suicide hit team that was seeking us on the way back to the airport at night in an armored Mercedes, and the darn dome light wouldn't go out. So it was like, here we are, here we are. As a member of the Ukraine caucus, I made multiple trips there, meeting with our top leaders. Last year, I visited the border and I viewed our aid arriving in Poland and met with our NATO allies, including the first meeting with U.S. members of Congress with the new German Chancellor Kohl. In 22, I visited a site where they were sifting soil trying to find the remains of a Navy pilot whose parachute never deployed over Laos. trying to discover thousands of unexploded ordnance now buried in the earth, killing and injuring innocent folks some 60 years later. I had to convince Amy to let me go to North Korea when a number of us tried to get the six-party nuclear talks started again. It was pretty eerie, especially when we saw the USS Pueblo still tethered to the dock in an icy harbor, and local citizens standing in military-like grill lines in Pyongyang at the bus in bitter cold, listening to patriotic music from the overhead speakers. We gave a full briefing to our ambassador, Howard Baker, when we got to Japan. But closing out my career couldn't escape some discussion of January 6th. So I just finished last weekend Liz Cheney's book, and I would heartily recommend it. Since 21, I was stunned that those inside the Trump White House failed to reveal what they saw firsthand to defend those of us that knew that Trump, in his own words, did everything totally appropriate. So wrong. And now we know even more details, how he let the conspiracy to not count the accurate electoral votes, including here in Michigan with false electors. I was in the Capitol that morning, and I watched the law enforcement folks unload under my Rayburn balcony. The idea still espoused today by the former president that the election was stolen here and in other states is simply false. So to close, what am I doing now? Well, first, as much as I would have liked been one of those marionettes pulling the right strings for a new speaker in October, I am so glad I am not there. And so is Amy. It is so toxic. I serve on a bipartisan biodefense board chaired by Joe Lieberman and former Homeland Security Secretary and former colleague Tom Ridge. HHS Secretary Shalala and former FDA Administrator underwriting a report to Congress for the next big one, the next pandemic. I serve on the Argonne National Lab Board with a number of university presidents as the only former legislator looking at a host of exciting energy and computing breakthroughs. And lastly, I'm a volunteer for No Labels, where we help today bring to the Detroit Economic Club 2 former governors, one Republican and one Democrat. You know, our 10 Republicans that voted for impeachment are very close. We call ourselves the Band of Brothers. At one of our first meetings, I was the only one to tell the others, is that me? I was the only one to tell the others that Trump would, in fact, run again and likely be the front runner. 3 years later, they all believe me. Trump and Biden are indeed the likely party nominees heading toward their respective conventions, particularly after Super Tuesday in March. Yet nearly 70% of Americans do not want that same choice of a rematch. And nearly that same percentage are willing to consider a bipartisan, or as I like to say it, a unity ticket of a Republican and a Democrat. Now both the DCCC and the RNC want to keep us out, and they will say anything to deny us ballot access and voters a different choice. I was with President Bush on Air Force One when Ross Perot called the plane to tell him that he was in. Perot got on all 50 states beginning in February of the election year, some 30 years ago. We're already on 12 states, and we're engaged in 27, months ahead of where Perot was. We can do better. And by the way, that was my campaign theme in 1986. God bless you all. Thank you for coming.
Bless you. Thank you, one and all, for being here. And Joe, please accept my apology for not turning the microphone over to you. I'm usually taking notes and being the reporter in the room, and I practice and practice, and I screwed up. I apologize. One other thing I'd like to mention is Fred is a great champion of child nutrition, and he pushed farm to school. And how smart was that for a member from Michigan who had an amazing array of fruits and vegetables in his district? And, pardon me?
You're prompting me to tell all these stories. So I went to one of Bob Dole's big birthday parties. It was in Statuary Hall, and he was turning either 85 or 90. I'd have to look it up to see when it was. He was out of the Congress. And I worked out of Bob Dole's office for a couple years. When I worked at the White House, we didn't have an office in the Capitol. So if you go to the gallery, House or Senate, you can't take notes. I don't care who you are, you can't take notes. So you have to go someplace else. And that was before C-SPAN. So we had to do it listening to the radio. You had to identify people's voices on the radio in Dole's office. And we had to log when the votes, Mr. Abner, they would go through the roll call vote. So I was particularly close to Dole, and we'd spend a lot of time there, and he would actually take me home at night sometimes. He would tell me that I had to sit on the back seat with Leader, that was his little schnauzer, and Leader had a nice silk blanket on the back seat, and I would make sure that I didn't wrinkle it as Dole sat in the front. And so we were close, we were always friends, and man, I remember I took a group to the honor flight from Kalamazoo to DC, and Dole met them all. I mean, he was, again, big time, many years retired, but he was thanking all of them. And but at his birthday, this is why I grabbed the mic from you. People were wishing him happy birthday. There was a little receiving line, and the guy ahead of me said, "Oh, happy birthday! I'm gonna be here for your next one." And he goes, "Better eat your vegetables."
Yeah, right. Oh, remember we had a president who didn't like broccoli, too. Anyway, we are going to have someone circulate the room and with a microphone so you can ask questions yourselves. Please limit them to a certain amount of time because we're all older and we need to get home. But Gina, do you want to?
So Sharman Moore, she's our co-founder of the Political History Society. For those of you who don't know, Sharman Moore, stand up.
Thank you.
She is the co-founder of Political History along with the late Kevin Kelly. So thank you, Sharman.
Thank you. Okay, any questions for Fred?
Oh, come on, there's so many
on.
brains in this room.
Well,
We have one right up here, Bill, Dennis Cawthorn? Bill Rustum up here up front.
Okay, we'll catch up with him.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Quick question, Fred. Is our party coming back? Are we doomed?
Man, I don't know, not here in Michigan, that's, but it's, I said I would have liked to have been to help. We're going to have divided government for a while. And the only way you're going to get things done, and there are so many issues, that you have to work together. I sure hope Congress doesn't go home tomorrow night. I said this yesterday. I was interviewed on MSNBC, and I said, the work's undone. I mean, they weren't there in October. They were all voting for speakers, so you couldn't even have a committee hearing. Then they got 10 days off for Thanksgiving. They even got Halloween off. That was on a Tuesday. And now they're going to get out, they want to get out tomorrow and not come back till like January 5th or 6th. And of course, the big issue is, are we going to, the CR, the continuing resolution expires, and isn't there a sweet spot for border security, which we need? And we, our Problem Solvers Caucus passed a bill, both for ag as well as for the Dreamers. And you need border, and we did a border security bill too. I mean, on top of those two things. Ukraine and Israel, we haven't even paid for the fires yet in Hawaii. You got this thing with China, with Taiwan. I mean, come on. And don't go home, at least, if you're gonna go home, at least do a Band-Aid to get you into February or so. I mean, what Biden was trying to do was do the whole year so we didn't have to deal with this struggle again, but maybe that just doesn't happen. But if you don't work together, nothing's going to happen. And, you know, the Senate is, you know, my sense is both the House and the Senate are going to flip. Redistricting changes that were announced today in New York is going to cancel out a number of Republican wins, but it's going to be close. But Pelosi had a close margin too. So, you know, to your question, if you want to get something done, that's the way to get it done, which is why I'm involved with No Labels, because then you would have a Republican and Democrat, and they'll be able to work with their respective sides, and it would be one term, and they'd say, come on, let's get this thing done.
Thank you. Mr. Cawthorn's coming through.
Yes.
Former
How are
House Minority
the-
Leader Dennis Cawthorn.
Thank you. How are the No Labels organization going to go about choosing a ticket if in fact they decide to do so?
Well, I would advise people to actually go online to read what our proposals were, sort of our, I'll call it Contract with America type. We had 30 proposals that were written by Contract with America. What did I say?
Did you really use that term?
No, but it's sort of like that. I mean, it's sort of like what happened. But we did, if you go to nolabels.org, you can pull it up. It's 30, you know, from border to, you know, discrimination to foreign aid, I mean, a whole number of good things. And there's a vetting process that's going. We actually have a number of folks that are raising their hands on both sides of the aisle. And so there's a vetting process that has begun to make sure that they're going to be good candidates. And the timing that we're looking at is immediately after Super Tuesday, which I think is March 8th, and so by the 17th, we plan to figure out who it is. We actually have, I mean, remember this organization has been around since about '08, so there are actually statewide organizations in every state in place already. I don't want to give out names, but we have a number of prominent Michiganders that are involved, and they're on Zoom calls. I did, I think, 7 states in Zoom calls last week, just bringing up people up to speed in terms we are.
So will you tell us what those states are, please?
What states I did?
Yeah.
I did Maine, I did New Hampshire, I did Missouri, I did Iowa, I did Michigan. I think Ohio was one of the states that I did. I mean, they combined a number of, I did a couple different events, and, you know, it's like Hollywood Squares for me. I mean, I just see the whole thing and I take questions. But until now, we've been involved really in issues. So New York, D.C., people would come in, they would meet with Republicans and Democrats in both the House and the Senate in the Capitol. I mean, they weren't political discussions. It was all focused on issues. So the CHIPS bill, the infrastructure bill, Larry Hogan, who's a national vice chair of No Labels, hosted us at his residence when he was governor of Indianapolis. We had governors and others come, and that's where we decided that, you know, what's really infrastructure and what's not, and how are we going to pay for it. And that was actually the same bill. We wrote it that weekend that the Senate then passed that summer, which we then passed in the House a few months later. So it's an engaging group, and, you know, our budget is $60 million just to get on the ballots, and we're doing that. So.
And as I say, all states are different. Yes, Joe?
Fred, would you give us your take
Look,
on the new Speaker of the House, Speaker Johnson?
So I served with Mike Johnson. He was elected in '16. He was a little bit of a backbencher, didn't speak much on the floor. He had a minor position in the leadership. He was elected in 18 or 20 for like assistant vice chair of the conference or whatever. He's a very pleasant individual. Very nice, and it's genuine. But he also comes from a district. There is no one to his right in the House. There is no one to his right. There really isn't. And, I don't know what his staff is like, he had to beef up, came out of the blue. Liz Cheney references him in her book, and she knew him a lot better because she was in our leadership. So she saw him, whereas I didn't see him. He wasn't in my building. I didn't vote with him. He wasn't on our committee, so I didn't know him all that well. But there is, it's, if you want to get something done, you got to work with both sides of the aisle, and I hope he comes to that realization, particularly as I look at these issues that they've got to deal with before we get to Christmas. But he's a smart guy. He really is.
It's good to hear he's smart. Shar, you have a question in the back of the room?
It's not a question, but this is Michigan history. Fred, you know how much I care about you. You were my first constituent visit on Capitol Hill when I was a young legislative rep from Michigan. Been doing it 26 years now. Just last year in October.
Sir, would you please introduce yourself?
Okay, Kevin
Thank you.
Traer, Michiana Area Vice President for the National Association of Postal Supervisors. We represent 48,000 supervisors, managers, and postmasters.
Thank you for the work you do, and thank you.
Thank you. Last year in October, Fred met with me and our local legislative rep in Kalamazoo and took all of 15 minutes with Dale over here, which we are going to come and see you before we leave. And he said, we got to stop this. There's an attack on our postal system throughout this country by Mr. DeJoy, and Fred led that march. In a year, we've had that largest consolidation in Michigan in the country stopped until now. And now they've opened an express lane because they don't feel like they've got anybody in their way anymore. But we're working on that. People that Fred has mentioned, I picked up new relationships with them. They're going to be getting on board soon, and hopefully we can pick up where Fred started this and had a December press conference within 10 seconds after us meeting. And it caused a lot of people to stop and think in D.C. So I got to get up here and say, I paid to come here out of my money to say thank you again for what you did for Michigan and the state of Michigan, and our identity as a postal service cannot be stripped away like they think they can be. So thank you, Fred.
Thank you, sir. As a staff member for the former chairman of the House Post Office and Civil Service Committee, I appreciate the post office, and I appreciate what you do, and thank you, Fred, for supporting. Do we have any? Yes, sir.
So, real quick,
Wait.
so,
Will you introduce yourself, please?
Fred,
Fred.
the other Fred,
Okay, another Fred.
with Western Michigan University. So we thank you for your years of advocacy on behalf of our region and the university. We talked about the CHIPS Act and these historic investments that are being made, but we're not seeing a lot of those dollars come back to Michigan. What do we need to do as a state to better compete and win some? We're one of, I think, 5 states on the map that hasn't gotten some of those dollars going back to Michigan.
Yeah, so it's just starting now. The money is just starting to get out. So it's $50 billion is what we did, but it's leveraged with, doubled that and even more so. So we knew that most of it was going to probably go to Ohio, and Arizona was going to get most of that money. But it's the products that that are the beneficiaries. So when I went to the auto show last year with the president, we saw parking lots full of Fords that they couldn't send to the dealers yet because they were missing the chip for, the passing light or, whatever that, what they do in the cars. Supply chain disruption in everything, phones as well as appliances. So that logjam now has been broken. So we're seeing that happen. But in terms of the manufacturing ends, I don't know that Michigan was ever going to be a beneficiary of it. But instead, what would happen is it was going to go overseas. So it was Germany, it was Taiwan, it was the Asian, some of the Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries that were going to just continue to knock our socks off, and we'd lose that forever. So our problem. So we met with the CEO of Intel, and he told us, we're not investing a dime in this country until you step up and do what the other countries are willing to do for us. We're not going to do it. And, you know, we got it done in a bipartisan vote. And Todd Youngs from Indiana, Senator, Republican, he was a great leader to get it through the Senate, but again, it was the House that held things up. And I just, you know, if we had bought, there were only 8 Republicans that voted for the CHIPS bill. If we had, this Congress, no way would have happened. So you would have lost another 3 years at least, and they would have gone elsewhere. But the supply chain things would still exist, and maybe those companies would have moved too. So there is an impact in Michigan, even though the manufacturing of it isn't happening. And it's remarkable. I've seen some of the new advances in the microchips. I mean, there's big divisions between the quality. It's incredible what we're doing. And our university's got to be part of that.
We have another question from Fred's district over here. Sharon, sir, will you please introduce yourself?
This is my good man. This guy helped lead my constituent service office in Kalamazoo and was one of the best hires I ever made.
So the rest of the story,
Yeah.
and I'm Dale Sugars, and in 2002, and from 86 to 2000, I was a supporter of Fred's. But in 2002, I ran against Fred in a primary. It was pretty vicious, very vicious. And in fact, so bad afterwards, I had to leave town to get a job. And so I went
I thought you went to Texas.
yeah. Went to Texas. That's about as far as I couldn't get one in Mexico, but I got one in Texas. So I went down there for 2 years and came up and went and worked for the home builders. And Matt Hall, you probably know Matt Hall, he was working with Terry Lynn Land. He says, Sugars, you should bury the hatchet with Fred Upton. I said, yeah, right in the back of the head. And so Fred and I, 2 weeks later, had lunch, and we forgave each other. And we've been best friends since then. My wife, Debbie, joined Amy and Fred to the prayer breakfast when President Obama was there. Had a wonderful experience. We're very close. In fact, he's going to let me play golf with him next year.
I'm still in witness protection. It is so bad, my golf.
Yeah, well, you haven't seen me play, so. But anyways, so he calls me up and he says, Nate Henschel, my staff person in Kalamazoo, is going to the Chamber of Commerce in Grand Rapids. We'd like to hire you to be the head of the district in Kalamazoo, district office. I said, Fred, I don't know. Let me think on it. Can you give me the weekend? He calls me up on Saturday morning. He says, you have any questions? I said, yeah. I said, you know, what happens if I don't agree with you on some of your votes? He says, well, many of my staff doesn't agree with what I said. And the reason I share that story is because Fred Upton's character is something that you want your grandchildren to grow up to be. Okay? It's integrity. Forgiveness. We all need to have forgiveness for ourselves, but for others. And I just wanted to share that story. And Fred, you are the best employer I've ever had. And I just, even though we disagree, it's kind of like my wife and I. And, but I really love you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Cool. I don't want to neglect this side of the room. We haven't had a question over here for a while. Yes, ma'am. She'll hustle over there.
I'm going, not as young as I used to be.
This room's not that conducive, so it's good if you wait for the microphone. Thank you.
I'm a midget in a room full of giants. I'm a former council member from Ann Arbor, Elizabeth Nelson. I'm following your advice and looking at the website for no labels, and I'm curious. There are a couple of things that I'm curious about because I've heard Alyssa Slotkin say a number of times that our democracy is not as healthy when we don't have two parties that are healthy, and one of my concerns about politics and what's going wrong is all of the money in it. And well, there are two questions I have. I'm curious, in your involvement with No Labels, do you feel like this is sort of a side route to figuring out how to marginalize sort of the crazier people, the more extreme people in the Republican Party. And I don't know, maybe that's too blunt of a question. My other question is, I'm looking at the website for No Labels, and this part concerns me, and I'm curious how you would respond to this. The law and the courts have been clear that an entity like No Labels that is focused only on ballot access, not the equivalent of a national political party, and therefore cannot be compelled to disclose its donors.
Yeah.
I'm curious
Yeah,
about
so
that.
That's really easy for me to answer. So I'm just a volunteer for No Labels, but we're viewed as a 501c4, right? So we're treated the same as pick whatever group it is. Right to Life, any environmental group, NAACP. None of them, in a Supreme Court ruling, affirmed it, have to tell who their donors are, because there could be a fear that those donors might be attacked somehow, all right? That's what we are. We are under the same guidelines. We are not going to run a presidential campaign. We are only getting ballot access, and if it comes to the point where we think that it is going to be Trump and Biden, we're going to then look at a Republican and a Democrat, and they will run their campaign. They will run that campaign themselves. They will comply with the FEC. They will raise their money. They'll do their schedule. They'll do all of that. All we're doing is doing the ballot access that then allows them to get on it. And they'll have to finish the last number of states. We can only do 34 states ballot access before the candidate has to be on the petition to say allow us to get the right signature. So that's why that's what that is. To the answering the questions of the crazies, and so we had a big audience today. Well, I'll ask this question here. How many people would be happy if the ticket for you to go on November 5th or 6th, I don't know what the date is, November 5th, would be Trump and Biden? Raise your hand. Okay, it sort of answers the question of, shouldn't we have a choice and let the voters have a choice if that's what it's going to be. Now, just the last thing that I'll say. Both the DCCC and the RNC are death on us. They want it to be the same system. They don't want us in, and they're doing everything that they can to deny us ballot access. They're challenging us in court. So far, they're over. They've lost every time. They just lost in Arizona when they challenged our signatures and to allow the choice. And we want to be the same as the Green Party or anybody else in terms of the same rules to get on. So they're going to say they've got their, Debbie Dingell is one of my best friends. She really is. She's on the line saying, you're just going to elect Trump. No, we're not. And as one that voted to impeach him, the last thing I want to do is see that happen. And the polls now, and I've seen the polls since March. A lot of polls across the country. I was convinced in March when I actually was able to see the data, Trump beats Biden one-on-one. And the rest of the country is seeing that now. I mean, in Michigan, the poll that came out this week, and I think it's accurate, Trump's ahead by 10 here. Biden won by 3. It's a 13-point swing. And I don't see Biden getting stronger. So we're just, right now, our first goal is ballot access. But once candidates are named, if we go forward, they're going to run the campaign, and all of their expenses will be itemized, as they should be.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Congressman Upton, for a great evening.